is Labour's shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, who, of course, is the Labour man in the hot seat on all these issues. Good to see you, Keir.
How are you?
Now, overnight, you have been talking about wanting to amend the EU withdrawal bill, I think, to sort of guarantee what's known as a period of transition. But I'm being a bit... frankly, I'm being a bit thick about this. What are you trying to achieve with this amendment?
Well, I think it's blindingly obvious to everybody that we're not going to complete the whole final deal scenario within the 2 years for Article 50. And therefore, we got a pretty stark choice in March 2019. Either we go off the cliff with no deal, which would be disastrous, or we go on to sensible transitional arrangements. And over the summer, I set out what they should be, which is basically within the single market and in a customs union on the same terms as now. The problem with the withdrawal bill is that it extinguishes the role of the European Court of Justice and it dismantles the apparatus of the single market and the customs union. Therefore, it needs to be amended to allow the sensible outcome in March 2019, which is to go on to transitional arrangements. So these amendments are really important.
No, I can absolutely see from your point of view they're important, but they're also quite complicated for people. So I'd quite like to break down what you mean by this. First of all, do you think that are you trying to amend the bill so that Parliament would have a vote on whatever emerges, deal or no deal?
That's a separate set of amendments, but equally important, which is that Parliament should have a say on whatever the Article 50 deal is, and I hope it's a deal, and I hope it's got transitionals in it. But we should also have a vote
on
if there's no deal, because no deal would be disastrous, and it cannot simply be waved through. So we want a vote on it, and I can tell you we'll vote against it.
And do you think Parliament would vote against it?
I think the consensus would be against it, because no deal is so disastrous. And
so can I ask you on that? Because the Prime Minister doesn't have much leverage in these negotiations, and there is an argument for saying that if Britain signals that no deal is not an option, then she has no stick at all.
I mean, this is the argument that the only way you get a decent deal is pretending that you'll jump off the cliff before you're pushed. But this casual talk of no deal, let's just work it out. It means no deal on trade. That means huge tariffs. It means no deal in Northern Ireland as to the border. That means a hard border if you've not had agreement. It means no deal for EU citizens here and for UK citizens abroad. It means no deal on counter-terrorism. And I know the Security and Intelligence Service would be extremely worried about that. So no deal is simply not viable.
And so just to be absolutely clear, were you in David Davis's position today, you would simply say to the EU that no deal is not an option for the UK?
It's not an option for the UK, and it's not an option for the EU. I've been backwards and forwards to not only Brussels, but many EU countries. None of those countries are saying to me no deal will work for them. But this sort of government by mantra, where we have no deal is better than a bad deal, Brexit means Brexit, it is not helpful, because you look behind the catchphrases and there's nothing there.
So can I just ask you then, and I want to talk to you about your negotiations with other people in Europe in a minute, but first of all about the nature of a transition. The Prime Minister's transition is actually simply a period for business to adjust to a deal she thinks, or a no deal, that she thinks she's going to get. Whereas I think you've got a different position. So I think you don't believe that trade negotiations can be concluded over the next year. No. And I think you believe that the transition would include an extension of negotiations. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister is clinging to the idea that by March 2019 we will have concluded the trade deal.
She's not clinging to it, she's absolutely categorically saying that's what she believes.
We will be implementing it. I don't believe that. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
I think that what will happen is we will have agreed, I hope, the Article 50 issues.
The divorce bill.
The divorce bill, what happens to EU nationals, etc., etc. I think we will have begun a sort of heads of agreement as what the future agreement might look like, and then we need a bridge from March 2019 to the final deal. So that's why it's a transitional arrangements and not an implementation phase.
I understand that, but what some people would say is, if we don't agree the trade deal before March 2019, ultimately we'll never leave the European Union, because the trade deal negotiations will go on forever. We will be paying into the EU at that point for access to the single market and the customs union. They will therefore have an incentive to just stretch the things out forever so that we continue to pay them, and we'll never leave.
Two answers to that. Article 50, which is the provision for leaving, actually says that the Article 50 deal is with a view to the future agreement, so it envisages not having the future agreement in place. But secondly, I think if this summer and this autumn's been about anything, it's about fantasy meeting reality. I'm fed up with the fantasy, the idea that all this can be done. This is really serious. Businesses are queuing up to tell me that they're making contingency plans for March 2019, and sooner or later they'll become self-fulfilling because they'll have to carry them out. So forget the fantasy, let's have reality. Let's have the national interest first, not self-interest.
Now, who have you been meeting? Have you met Barnier, had these...
Yes, I've met Michel Barnier a number of times, and his team. I've met the ambassador. I've met many EU countries out there. And I'll say this just to be clear. Some of those meetings have been facilitated by David Davis, and so none of this is intended to undermine his position. It's to make sure that we, the opposition, are fully informed and that we can influence, because however much we may challenge the government, and we do, however much we say that their chaotic and divided approach is causing harm, and it is, we want the negotiations to succeed in the national interest.
Now, he says he would like to collaborate with you on this, but he wants the answer to two questions. One is, after we've got a trade deal, what the role of the ECJ should be at that point.
Yes.
And the other is how much Labour thinks we should be handing over as a divorce bill.
Yeah,
so
well,
can you answer that?
Let me take those on head-on. I have always been critical of the Prime Minister for ruling out any role at all for the European Court of Justice, because it's a huge contradiction in her position. She says, on the one hand, I want a comprehensive, rich, special relationship with the EU, and she said, on the other hand, I don't want the institutions that go with it. You can't have both, and sooner or later, I mean, this is already bedeviling phase one, it's bedeviling phase two. We've said keep options on the table. There may be a role for the European Court of Justice or a court of some sort. Don't sweep these things off the table, because you simply won't make progress, and you can see the problems that's already causing. On the money, I have never challenged David Davis for not putting a sum or a figure on the money. What I've said is you've agreed in principle that you'll honour your commitments. That's right. What now needs to happen is you need to say what's the framework by which you'll arrive at a sum. And that's what we, Labour, would do. That's where I've pushed him. I have not pushed him on the sum. I've also not criticised him for trying to keep the sum as low as possible.
I mean, you've obviously looked at the kind of formulae that might apply. Can I just... your own view, do you think the sum that we'll end up paying is nearer to 30-40 or 70-80?
I'm not going to get into this, Rob. I'm not going to get into it, because at this stage we need to agree the principles. There's then negotiation on the principles. We should keep it as low as possible, and it should be paid over a period of time. But as low as... and I agree with the government on that. I'm sure that's what David Davis is trying to achieve. The problem at the moment...
But can I just ask on a related money issue then? So you've said, you've held out the possibility of an ongoing role for the European Court of Justice. Are you also holding open the possibility that we would continue to pay something in the way that Norway does for continued access to the customs union?
In the transitional period.
No, after the transition period.
After the transitional period, we'll have to see, subject to negotiations.
Okay.
Obviously, ideally, no, or keep it low. But in the end...
But if you got better, if Britain got better access, it's worth paying something.
Well, it's a very simple thing. If economically it's better off to have an arrangement that works for our businesses and secures our economy, then we'd do it. I mean, anybody who says, I would rather an arrangement which actually damages our business needs to think again about why they're negotiating.
We will have much more from Keir after the break. I thought all that was absolutely fascinating. See you in a minute or two. Welcome back to Peston on Sunday. Now, I offered a cliff edge exit to Keir Starmer, but strangely, he's chosen to stay in his seat. First, Allegra.
Well, Keir Starmer told us that Labour wouldn't agree an actual divorce payment. Instead, they'd agree a formula. Well, there's been some criticism. Here we have Dan Hodges saying, here we go again. Starmer says he would produce formulae for agreeing a sum. Why? If the EU says it's more, he would have to pay. You're biting your lip there, Keir Starmer. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But first, Labour stands up for the many, not the few, they tell us. But what about when the many are also quite comfortably off? Their promise to scrap tuition fees won them the hearts of a great many. But let's look at who it benefits. This is a chart from the IFS, and this is scrapping tuition fees and the lifetime savings for graduates. You don't really need me to tell you, but I will. Clearly, the richer you are over the course of your lifetime, the more you are going to save from that that policy. One Labour MP, Phil Wilson, recently called this a subsidy to the middle classes. Meanwhile, the benefit freeze is about to come in. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation tweeted this. The freeze is going to mean 500,000 more being plunged into poverty. Now, Labour has not been clear about whether it would end that or not, but at the moment it looks like pretty funny priorities, doesn't it, Robert?
So I do want to pick that up with you, Keir. I mean, you know, nobody would say you're an ultra-Corbynista, but perhaps you are veering towards the centrist dad, but nonetheless, this does look like slightly odd priorities for a Labour Party, rewarding the middle classes rather than attacking poverty.
I'm always slightly nervous about wandering off my own brief onto somebody else's, but I think the tuition fees was important because of the message it sent to young people about not individually do you benefit, but the fact that we all benefit when students are able to go off to college, to university, and deliver into and contribute to society. I have always been very keen, on the other hand, on the early years stuff that the last Labour government did. I think it was transformative, and I've always wanted us to have just as strong an emphasis on that, because that really changes lives of very young children, because, as you know, it's in those early years that things are formed, and if that's not gripped, it's very, very difficult for children to succeed after that.
Now, on that other big election issue, which is the control of immigration, I think you've said that Labour policy post-Brexit would be to say that EU migrants could come still, but if they haven't got a job after 3 months, then you would have the right to send them home again. Is that right?
Not quite. And again, here I'm veering onto the territory that is the Shadow Home Office territory. What I said, I didn't say...
Part of the Brexit negotiations.
It's part of the Brexit negotiations. Obviously, we as a party have got to set out what we mean by fair management of migration, which was in our manifesto. I've not advocated it as Labour Party policy. I have said I would want to explore at least the better enforcement of the current rules. I think most people think that freedom of movement means you can move over any border and stay for as long as you like in another EU country. That's not right. You could move for 3 months, after which you've either got to have a job, you've got to be a student, or you've got to be self-sufficient.
But the point... you explore that, you say?
Explore, I mean...
But the point about that...
But
just to be clear... Yes, that is consistent with the current rules, but only if you've got a registration system.
Yes.
Because you can't enforce it
Yes.
unless... And the reason it can't be enforced in Britain is because we don't have identity cards. So do you think we should revisit the issue of identity cards?
Well, I'm not advocating revisiting identity cards, but you're absolutely right. There may have to be some sort of registration scheme. I think that's what the Prime Minister was hinting at when she spoke about this in recent months, and it's probably what she envisages for March 2019. And I'm not saying that's the complete answer, so don't get me wrong. There are other things that will have to change. It's a much bigger package. All I'm saying is that we need, again, to deal with the reality of what the current rule is and look at how that can be better enforced and what else needs to happen. But to do it knowing what the rule actually is rather than what people think it is.
But it does seem to me that you do believe fundamentally that you can achieve your aims of, for example, controlling immigration, but yet retain access in a fundamental way to the European single market.
Yes, I think long-term it's really important that we do retain the benefits of the single market and the customs union, and therefore, and that's going to be a long negotiation, not a straightforward negotiation. But those benefits to our businesses and to our economy should not be underestimated. So, of course, we should be negotiating with that in mind as the end goal, which is what we, the Labour Party, have set out over and over again.
And then finally, because we're almost out of time, opinion polls show two things. One is a growing number of people think that negotiations for Brexit are going very badly.
I'm not surprised at that.
But secondly, actually a growing number of people do appear to be regretting the vote to leave. Is it conceivable that if public opinion shifted massively away from Brexit, that actually the Labour Party could change its position on this and recommend staying in the EU?
Well,
is it conceivable?
We've never advocated a second referendum. We've always accepted the result. I don't know what's going to happen to public opinion. It's changed. I've only been an MP for 2 years. It seems like a lot longer. And the currents and cross-currents have been incredible in that period. But we're not calling for a second referendum, and we will be leaving the EU in March 2019, and therefore what we've got to say is what's the future progressive partnership based on collaboration and cooperation that we want, because it was the values that I voted to remain because of my values of collaboration and cooperation and international.
And a bit like your leader, you'd vote Remain again?
Of course, I would vote the way I did last time for the reasons I did last time, but I would equally do what I did last time, which is respect the outcome.
Lovely to see you, Keir, and we'll doubtless see much more of you in the coming weeks and months. So let's...